Good evening. I'm your host, and welcome to Kenya News Update today. In a dramatic escalation of Middle East tensions that has reverberated across the globe, Iranian strikes on the United Arab Emirates have left 58 people injured. Among the casualties are multiple African nationals, thrusting the continent into the heart of a widening international crisis. Tonight, we dedicate our full 12-minute deep dive to unpacking this complex story. We'll examine the attack itself, the African connection, the geopolitical chessboard involving the United States, Russia, and Europe, and what this means for Kenya and the continent at large. This is a story of distant conflict with very close-to-home consequences. Let's begin with the facts as we know them on this evening of March 3, 2026. Earlier today, Iranian forces launched a coordinated missile and drone strike against targets in the United Arab Emirates. The precise locations and military objectives are still being assessed by international observers. What is confirmed is the human toll. 58 individuals were wounded in the attacks. While the UAE has not released a full, official breakdown of nationalities, multiple sources, including Africanus, confirm that citizens from several African nations are among the injured. This detail transforms the incident from a regional Middle Eastern event into a pan-African concern. The UAE is a critical hub for Africa, home to hundreds of thousands of expatriate workers, a major transit point for travel, and a vital trade partner. An attack on its soil is effectively an attack on a global crossroads where Africa is a key participant. To understand why this happened, we must rewind the clock. The immediate catalyst appears to be the ongoing shadow war between Iran and a U.S.-Israeli alliance. Just yesterday, Al Jazeera reported on the evacuation of babies from an Iranian hospital damaged by what were described as U.S. and Israeli strikes. Iran's attack on the UAE is widely seen as a retaliatory measure, a message of force to demonstrate its capability to strike back beyond its immediate neighbors. However, the choice of target is significant. The UAE has historically walked a diplomatic tightrope, maintaining workable relations with Iran while being a key U.S. security partner in the Gulf. This strike suggests Iran may be calculating that those regional balances have shifted, or that it needs to send a message that no U.S. ally is safe. This brings us directly to the stance of the United States. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has issued a stark warning. He stated that a war with Iran could last weeks, not months or years, implying a strategy of overwhelming decisive force. Concurrently, the U.S. State Department has issued advisories urging American citizens in dozens of countries to consider leaving, a sign of anticipating widespread retaliatory actions or instability. This hawkish posture from Washington creates a dangerous feedback loop. Each action prompts a reaction, escalating the stakes. For African nations with citizens in the Gulf or with strategic interests there, this U.S. posture narrows the diplomatic space for de-escalation and places their people directly in the crossfire of a great power confrontation. Now, let's layer in another dimension, the Russia factor. While our main story unfolds in the Gulf, a parallel drama is playing out in Europe, with direct implications for global alliances. The Guardian Africa reports that the Swedish military recently jammed a Russian drone operating near a French aircraft carrier. France suspects this is part of a Russian provocation campaign, a hybrid warfare tactic aimed at destabilizing European nations that support Ukraine. This incident on day 1466 of the Ukraine war highlights a critical point. Global conflicts are no longer siloed. Russia's actions in Europe and its alliance with Iran create a connected axis of tension. When Iran strikes the UAE, it does so with the tacit, or perhaps explicit, backing of a Moscow that is actively testing Western resolve on multiple fronts. This interconnectedness means African nations cannot analyze the Gulf crisis in isolation. It is part of a broader, multi-theater challenge to the US-led world order. This brings us to the European response, which further illustrates the global realignment. In a landmark announcement, France has declared it will increase its nuclear arsenal and deepen European weapons cooperation. This is a direct, long-term response to the dual threats perceived from Russia and the broader instability exemplified by Iran's actions. Europe is moving towards strategic autonomy, preparing for a world where American security guarantees might be less predictable or focused elsewhere. For Africa, this European militarization presents both challenges and opportunities. It could mean a more assertive Europe in African security affairs, but also a potential new partner for defense partnerships, albeit one with its own stringent conditions. Let's now focus sharply on the African angle. The presence of African nationals among the injured in the UAE is a tragic but predictable outcome of global labor flows. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, are primary destinations for economic migrants from East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and West Africa. Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Somalia, Nigeria, and Ghana all have significant diasporas in the region. These communities work in construction, hospitality, healthcare, and domestic services. They are the backbone of the Gulf service economy, but often find themselves with limited protections when political or military storms hit. Their vulnerability highlights a major policy gap for African governments, robust consular protection, and evacuation plans for citizens caught in overseas conflicts. The lack of a coordinated African Union mechanism for such crises leaves individual nations scrambling and families in anguish. We must also consider the economic fallout. The UAE is a critical financial and logistics hub for Africa. Dubai's ports handle a massive volume of Africa-bound goods, and its airports are a central nexus for travel and commerce. Any sustained conflict or insecurity in the UAE would disrupt supply chains, increase shipping insurance costs, and potentially freeze financial transactions. For a continent already grappling with economic headwinds, this is a severe threat. The Kenyan shilling, for instance, could face pressure from rising oil prices if the Strait of Hormuz is threatened. Tourism between Africa and the Gulf, another revenue stream, would likely plummet. The economic ripples from this single attack could wash up on African shores for months. Now, let's hear the debate. Perspective 1 argues that Africa must unequivocally condemn Iran's attack. Proponents of this view state that targeting a civilian-heavy global hub, like the UAE, is a violation of international law and a direct threat to African lives and livelihoods. They argue that African nations should stand in solidarity with the UAE in international forums like the UN and demand accountability from Tehran. This camp believes that clear moral and strategic alignment with stable Gulf partners is in Africa's best long-term interest. They point to the massive investments from the UAE into African infrastructure and agriculture as a relationship worth defending vigorously. Perspective 2 offers a more nuanced, non-aligned position. This viewpoint cautions against Africa being drawn into a Middle Eastern conflict that is, at its core, a proxy war between the US and Iran. Advocates remind us that many African nations have historically maintained decent diplomatic and trade ties with Iran. They argue that Africa's role should be that of a neutral mediator, calling for de-escalation from all sides: the US, Israel, and Iran. This camp warns that taking sides could make African expatriates and interest targets for retaliation. They emphasize that Africa's priority should be the safe evacuation of its citizens and lobbying for humanitarian pauses, not picking a side in a conflict that does not serve the continent's core developmental goals. Perspective 3 introduces a harder edge, focused on sovereignty and opportunity. Some analysts suggest that the global turmoil, from Ukraine to the Gulf, exposes the fragility of the existing world order. For them, this is a moment for Africa to assert its own strategic autonomy, much like Europe is attempting. This could mean fast-tracking the operationalization of the African Standby Force to evacuate citizens independently, deepening intra-African trade to reduce dependency on volatile external hubs, and playing the great powers against each other to secure better deals on investment and technology. In this view, crisis is not just a threat. It's a catalyst for a more independent African geopolitical stance. Let's look at some comparative numbers to ground this debate. Consider the value of a human life in a conflict zone versus the cost of preventing a conflict. In a related story of instability from West Africa, Benin police are offering a €30,000 reward for information leading to alleged coup plotters. That's €30,000 to potentially stop a destabilizing event. Contrast that with the incalculable cost of caring for 58 injured people, the trauma to their families, and the economic disruption. It's a stark reminder that investment in stability and intelligence is far cheaper than dealing with the aftermath of violence. What does this mean for Kenya specifically? First, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs must immediately account for all Kenyan nationals in the UAE. A clear, publicly communicated emergency protocol is needed. Second, Kenya must engage in urgent diplomacy at the AU level to craft a unified African response. A fragmented continent will have no voice in this crisis. Third, the National Security Council should assess the implications for Kenya's own security. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, for instance, may seek to exploit global distractions or draw inspiration from Iran's asymmetric tactics. Finally, Kenya's economic planners must model scenarios for supply chain disruption and oil price shocks to build buffers. In conclusion, the Iranian strikes on the UAE are a stark wake-up call. They prove that in our interconnected world, a conflict in the Persian Gulf is instantly a crisis in Africa. The injured African nationals are not collateral damage in a faraway war. They are our neighbors, family members, and contributors to our economies, caught in a geopolitical storm. The responses from President Trump, from France, and from Russia all paint a picture of a world hardening into blocs and preparing for more conflict. Africa cannot afford to be a passive bystander. Must leverage its collective voice, protect its citizens, and navigate these treacherous waters with a strategy that prioritizes African stability and prosperity above all. The events of March 3, 2026 have made it clear global instability is no longer someone else's problem. It is here at our doorstep, and it demands our smartest, most unified response. For Kenya News Update Today, I'm your host. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today.